Hi, my name is Staci Miller, and I'm the co-founder of 97%. And I am proud to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Michael Siegel, Professor of Public Health and Community Medicine at the Tufts University School of Medicine. We first met Dr. Siegel in 2019, soon after launching 97%. And we've been collaborating with him and underwriting the research that he's going to be sharing with you today for more than a year. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Siegel so he can share a lot of the research and the data that we've been alluding to all day.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Staci, for that introduction. And it has been such a pleasure to work with you and with 97% over the last couple of years and to see how things have really taken off and developed since then. So today, what I would like to do is to present the results of research that we've done, which has been funded by 97% over the last year or so. And the ultimate goal here was to produce a policy platform that represents the common ground between gun owners and non-gun owners. We heard a lot of talk during the congressional panel. I think Congressman Walsh and Congressman Moulton and Congresswoman Dean all agreed that, where we need to go is to find the common ground. I think Congressman Walsh called it the sweet spot. Where is that common ground? We know it exists. We think it exists. And so the purpose of this research was to find out where is the common ground, and can we take that common ground and build an actual policy platform that all sides of the issue can support. And I'm going to argue today that we've done that, and I want to present that platform. So first of all, just another gun policy platform. So what? You've heard this before, and you've heard about 12-point plans and 14-point plans, and is this just going to be another? What's different from this than other platforms that you've heard about? Well, first, just some quick disclosures. I want to again acknowledge funding for this project from the 97%. I also want to emphasize that the views that I express are my own and do not necessarily represent those of 97%. And third, I want to acknowledge my co-investigators, Kathleen and Green and Amani Durrani. Both are with the Tufts University School of Medicine. Okay, so here are the reasons why this is not just another gun policy platform. Here's what we did differently. So number one, this platform was developed after extensive research. We did not just sit down and say, okay, let's just sit down and kind of brainstorm and see what we can come up with. We did extensive research lasting just about a year. And there were three parts to the research. First, we did a very focused review of the evidence regarding the effectiveness of federal and state gun laws. So we wanted to look at what laws work, what laws don't work. What's the evidence show us? Second, we did a nationally representative survey of over 1,000 gun owners. And the goal of that was to identify what are the areas of common ground and to try to understand about specific provisions of gun laws. So not just to ask gun owners, what's typically done is, do you support background checks? Do you support red flag laws? But to go into the very specific details of each law to try to figure out, how do the details of the laws affect gun owners' opinions? And then third, we did a combination of focus groups and interviews with about 100 individuals representing all sides of the issue, both gun owners and non-gun owners, and also talking to leaders of gun rights organizations and gun violence prevention organizations. So that's the first thing that was different here, is just the fact that this is based on research. Second, the platform was developed after extensive consultation with gun owners and gun rights organizations. Every one of the groups that are represented here, we consulted with, and the use of their logos here in no way, obviously, indicates an endorsement of our platform, but what it does indicate is my gratitude, our gratitude to these organizations for taking the time to sit down with us and make sure that we got the questions right on the survey. Because if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get meaningful answers. The third thing that we did differently is that this platform is derived specifically from the common ground or the sweet spot, as Congressman Walsh called it. And it flows directly from that common ground. So the purpose wasn't just to say, okay, if we could develop a policy of effective, a platform of effective policies, what would we throw into the mix? Just a wish list of all the policies we would throw in. It was to specifically say, if we wanted to build a platform from that area of common ground, which we know exists, what would we build? What would flow from that? So this policy that we're going to present today flows directly from the common ground that we identified in our research. The fourth thing that makes this different is that our goal was to identify a limited set of policies that could have the greatest impact on fire and violence. The picture you see here is a spreadsheet from one of my computer Excel spreadsheets where we compiled a list of state gun laws. And this is just a partial list. There's about 117 different types of laws that we cataloged among the states. And from my experience, especially my experience in tobacco control, realized that it's not particularly helpful to come out with a recommendation or a platform of, here are 35 laws that you can pass, that we'd like to see passed, because what you really need is a very small set of laws that you can push as a priority in every state. So the goal of this was to find a small set of laws that realistically could be promoted in all 50 states to have the biggest impact on gun violence. The fifth thing that made this package unique is that we made an attempt to develop a package of policies that maximize the effectiveness in terms of reducing gun violence while minimizing any interference with the ability of law-abiding citizens to purchase, possess, and use guns. So this is kind of a maximization, minimization problem. And you can see on this curve here where the red, where the red area is kind of the area where you want to be. You want objective 1 to be minimized and objective 2 to be maximized. In our case, objective 1 is interfering minimally with gun rights, and objective 2 is having a maximum effect on gun violence. So finding that area was part of the goal of this platform. The sixth thing that makes this platform different is that we aim to describe laws in enough detail so that their specific provisions were clear. So we're not just going to tell you at the end of this presentation that what we support is universal background checks, permit laws, and red flag laws. It's going to sound like that, but we're going to tell you specifically the provisions of those laws that we think are necessary, both for the laws to be effective and for the laws to protect the rights of gun owners and to interfere minimally with gun owner ability to access firearms. And number 7 is that this platform aims specifically to identify wins for gun owners, with the underlying philosophy being that this can't be a zero-sum game and that it doesn't need to be a zero-sum game. We recognize that why would gun owners be interested in supporting a platform that had nothing in it for them? There has to be a compromise. There has to be something in this for gun owners in order for them to get on board and support this. So this is not a zero-sum situation. It's not an I win, you lose situation. It's not a situation where we tried to come up with concessions that we would just go out and say, hey, gun owners, we want you to make these concessions. It was truly an effort to say, we're willing to make some compromises here. And let's see if we can make compromises in a way that actually improves public safety. And we think from our research, we thought that that was possible. And hopefully we were able to pull that off. So I want to start by reviewing just a brief review of the research. We did release this earlier as part one of our the two-part series, but for those who haven't seen it, I just to kind of set up talking about the platform, I want to just briefly review our findings. So the first thing we did is this focus review of the evidence regarding the effectiveness of federal and state gun laws. And just kind of summarize briefly our findings. We summarized the findings in this monograph, which was published by the Rockefeller Institute. What are the most effective policies in reducing gun homicides? And essentially what we did is we broke laws into certain categories. So we had what we called the WHO laws. And the WHO laws are laws that regulate who can have access to guns. So the idea being laws that aim to prevent guns from getting in the hands of people who are at high risk. Things like universal background checks, may issue laws, violent misdemeanor laws. The second set of laws were the what. We called the what laws. And those were laws that regulated the actual product. So things like assault weapon bans, ammunition, magazine capacity bans, one gun per month laws, because they regulate the what, the gun, how many guns can you buy? We looked at laws regulating when firearms may be used, such as standard ground laws, and laws regulating why firearms may be purchased, such as trafficking laws. And very clearly, the conclusion that we came to was it was a very general but clear conclusion. And what we found was that laws that regulate the what, that is what guns and products are allowed, do not have much of an impact on overall levels of population homicide. And in contrast, laws that regulate the who, that is who has legal access to firearms, may have an appreciable impact on firearm homicide. And especially if access is being restricted specifically to those people who are at the highest risk of violence, namely people who have a history of violence or are determined to represent an imminent threat of violence. There were three specific laws that we found to be overwhelmingly the most effective. And the first was what we call violent misdemeanor laws. And these are laws which basically change the threshold for gun ownership. The current threshold, according to federal law, is essentially not being a felon. That's basically sums it up. If you're not a felon, if you're not a convicted felon, with a few other exceptions, you can own a gun. You could commit violent crimes. You could commit 10 violent crimes, and as long as they are only misdemeanors, punishable as misdemeanors, you can own a gun under federal law. That many states have corrected that loophole. Not many, actually, a small number have corrected that loophole by basically saying, look, the point here, the intent of the law is to prevent people with a criminal history from owning guns. Why should how it's prosecuted affect whether or not a person can own a gun or not? And so we looked at the effect of state laws where they did implement this kind of lowered threshold or more stringent threshold. And amazingly, in both of the studies that we conducted, there was about an 18 to 19% decline in firearm homicide associated with these laws. It appears to us that this is the most effective law to reduce firearm violence on a population level. The second most effective law that we found were permit laws, laws that required a state permit in order to purchase or possess a gun. And you can see that the results that we got in two different studies. In one case, there was a 10% drop firearm homicide. In the other study, a 16% drop. So not quite as effective in terms of the numbers as the violent misdemeanor laws, but certainly very substantial in terms of their effect. The other thing I want to point out is that we did a specific study looking at mass public shootings to see what laws could be effective in preventing mass shootings, since that's obviously a major aspect of gun violence. And we found out that only one law of all the laws we studied, we looked at about 117. There was only one law out of the 117 that was significantly associated with reduced incidence of mass shootings, and that was state permit laws. Now, one of the things that we learned in the course of doing this research was that there's an interplay between universal background checks and permit laws. So there are a number of ways to do universal background checks. Everyone, I think, pretty much agrees that there should be universal background checks. You have to check. You can't look at someone to know whether they have a violent history. You have to do some sort of check. But the question is how to do that check. There's a number of mechanisms to do that. One is what's called a point of purchase check, which means you wait till the person is ready to buy a gun. And when they come into the store to buy the gun, you do the background check. But another approach is to run it more like a driver's license. You only go once to get your driver's license. You show that you're capable, you meet the requirements, and then that's it. You don't have to, every time you get in a car, you don't have to go through a background check to make sure that you're still eligible to drive that car. You just do it once. You have to renew it every 5 or 10 years or whatever it is. But essentially, it streamlines the process. Well, it turns out that the research shows pretty definitively that permit to purchase laws, permit laws, not background checks, are more effective in decreasing violence. In other words, states that only have point of purchase background checks, we and others did not find an effect in reducing firearm violence. But states that implemented the background checks through a permit requirement did have a substantial reduction in firearm violence. And the evidence was very robust. A lot of this evidence comes out of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. Daniel Webster and his colleagues, Cassandra Krifasi and Alexander McCourt, have done some remarkable work. And the studies are really convincing. You just look at them. You don't even have to look at the statistics, and you can see the effect. So here's what happened when Missouri repealed their gun law. So this line is basically, the blue line represents in 2007 when they repealed their permit law. They had a permit law up until that point. And you can see that the orange represents the firearm homicide rate in Missouri. The blue is all other states. And the green is all other states in the Midwest. You can see that there's a marked difference that occurred right at the point where they repealed the permit law, and then it kind of skyrocketed after that, totally different than what was happening in the rest of the country. And you can also see an effect on firearm suicides. It was pretty much parallel with the rest of the country. Permit was repealed, permit law was repealed, and then it shot up. The same thing was true in a state after it implemented permit law. So here, Connecticut in 1995 implemented a permit law, and you can see that it is exactly the opposite. The rates of firearm violence were kind of increasing. As soon as that law went into effect, they plummeted in Connecticut, whereas in the rest of the country, they remained flat. And again, the same thing with suicide, not quite as dramatic, but still, the rates were kind of coming along, and then they fell strongly in Connecticut, the orange here, much more rapidly than they did in the rest of the country. So there's very strong evidence that permit laws are effective. The third most effective law we found was red flag laws. And before I get to the red flag laws, there were several key findings that I want to highlight that came out of these studies. One of them is that federal background checks are not likely to be effective at identifying prior misdemeanor offenses. So state and local background checks are necessary. And I think this is probably the reason why these permit laws are effective, because these are state permits. And when they do the background checks, they check state and local databases. State and local databases are far more effective at identifying prior misdemeanors than federal databases. Federal databases are great for identifying felonies, but for the little offenses that domestic violence types offenses and other misdemeanors, there's really very poor reporting from states, from local courts to the federal government. So it has to be done at the state or local level to be most effective. And in fact, Sumner, in their research, found that local background checks are in fact the most effective, that state background checks are also effective, but that federal background checks are the least effective. So the level at which you do these background checks is critical. The third law that we found that was had a profound effect was red flag laws. And in these studies, there was an effect on firearm suicide. Firearm suicide rates in Indiana dropped by about 10%, in Connecticut by about 16%. More recent study that was done in 2021 included a lot more states, since a lot more states at that point had implemented these laws. Overall, they found about a 6.4% drop in firearm homicide. What exactly does this mean? Firearm suicide. So what exactly does this mean? Well, Swanson did a very interesting study in which this research group quantified how many extreme risk protection orders needed to be issued for life saved. And what they found was that in Indiana, just very similar as to Connecticut, they were able to save one life for every 10 gun removal actions. That's an incredibly efficient intervention. If you can issue 10 red flags, 10 extreme protection orders, and save one life for each of those 10, that's incredibly effective. So that's what we learned from our research on the effectiveness of gun laws. What did we learn from the survey with gun owners? Well, we learned several things. First of all, that the most central principle that gun owners believe is that people who are convicted of a violent crime should not be able to possess a gun. 81%, overwhelming percentage of gun owners believe that. 81%, same percentage, believe that one of the primary goals of gun laws should be to keep guns out of the hands of people who are at the highest risk of violence, while allowing law-abiding citizens to obtain guns. And then when we phrased it a different way, a similarly high level of support among gun owners, one of the primary goals of gun laws should be to develop criteria that keep guns out of the hands of people who are at high risk of violence while not preventing access to guns by law-abiding citizens. That is clearly the bedrock principle that we've discovered among gun owners. And in fact, that is the identified common ground. So the common ground is that everybody, regardless of political affiliation, political ideology, or gun ownership, believes that people who are at high risk for violence shouldn't have guns, and that we should keep guns from those people and try to do it in a way that minimizes interference with the rights of law-abiding gun owners to access these products. Another thing we found was that gun owners almost uniformly agree that owning a gun for self-defense is a constitutional right, fundamental constitutional right. 83% believe that. But at the same time, the majority of gun owners, very large majority, recognize that, like free speech, the right to own a gun is constitutionally protected, but there are exceptions. And only 37% said that the right to own a gun is absolute and cannot be altered in any way. And the third important thing, and again, this is maybe the third area of common ground, is that a large majority of gun owners are concerned about gun violence and they want to personally do something about it. So 65% of gun owners were concerned about the increase in gun crimes in cities, 71% concerned about the frequency of mass shootings, 75% concerned about school shootings, and a full 70% of gun owners want to help find a way to reduce gun deaths and injuries. So that's the common ground that we have to work with. We also found, importantly, that gun owners' opinions regarding specific firearm laws is highly dependent on the specifics of those laws. So, for example, for universal background checks, only 20% of gun owners support that law under any conditions. And only 17% oppose that law under any conditions. The majority of gun owners, 63%, their opinion actually depends on what the specific provisions are of that universal background check law. And the same was true for all of these other laws that we looked at. Red flag laws, 68% of people were dependent on what the specific provisions of the law were. Permit requirements, 63% of gun owners their support was dependent on the exact details. And so this was a critical finding because what it showed us is that our policy can't just come out and say, we're going to have this law, and this law. We have to specifically articulate what are the details, what are the specific provisions of the policies, because that's what's going to dictate whether gun owners support or oppose the policy when it comes down to it. And similarly, we found that gun owner support for policies could be increased by addressing their specific concerns that they expressed about specific provisions of those laws. So, for example, for universal background checks, although 73% said that they support the law, when asked a general question, do you support universal background check laws? When we added certain provisions, specific provisions to the law to protect aspects of gun rights, support went up to 78%. For red flag laws, we were able to get support as high as 81% by including certain provisions in the law. Permits had the greatest effect, where there was 47.5% support initially, but with a certain set of specific provisions, support skyrocketed up to about 76%. And background checks for concealed permit was already very high, but it went even higher when we put in certain specific provisions. Okay, what about the results from our focus groups and interviews? Well, pretty simple. The takeaway from the interviews was that this confirmed that there's one major area of common ground between gun owners and non-gun owners, and specifically that is the wide support behind a policy that prevents violent criminals from accessing guns. So before I get to the platform, which I'm about to do, I just want to kind of emphasize that I find it interesting that this is exactly what Congressman Walsh and Congressman Moulton and Congresswoman Dean expressed this morning when they talked about, how can we proceed further? Their comments were all, I think they all agreed, the way to proceed is to focus on doing everything we can to keep guns out of the hands of the people who are at highest risk for violence. And clearly, I don't think they knew about this research when they made those comments. It turned out to be very prescient and insightful because the research completely supports that approach. Okay, so the platform. Here's what the platform is. And by the way, I'm going to make sure to finish by 4:15, so there's a full 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers, which I will entertain right after I get through the platform here. Okay, so the foundation for the platform is that gun policies should ensure that people who are at high risk for violence cannot access guns while interfering minimally with the ability of law-abiding gun owners to purchase and possess guns. And the question is, so how do you do that? And that was what the bulk of our research in the last few months has been focused on, is how do you execute that in law? Well, here's how you do it. To achieve this objective, you need a package of several policies. So conceptually, what you need is four things. First, you need to establish a sensitive and specific threshold for gun ownership. Second, you need an efficient and minimally intrusive method to assess if someone meets those criteria, right? It's not enough to just have the criteria. You have to check to see if someone meets the criteria. So you need an as efficient and minimally invasive system as you can. Third, you need a mechanism to prevent someone who already has a gun, but later meets the criteria, but later no longer meets the criteria, to be prevented from accessing a gun. Because obviously people change over time, and somebody may have a clean record at the time they get a gun, but then may commit a crime. So you need a mechanism to be able to change their status when they become prohibited. And then fourth, you need a mechanism to temporarily remove a gun from someone who's at very high acute risk for causing them harm to themselves or others. And so we have what turns out to be a three-part platform, luckily, that we think accomplishes this while in a way that maximizes the effect of reducing gun deaths, while at the same time minimizing the impact on gun owners. So the first policy is we need a sensitive and specific threshold for gun owners. What is the greatest risk factor for the commission of violence? Research clearly shows that it's a history of violence, and there's a ton of research. There's a solid body of research to back that up. So, so the first law is what we call violent misdemeanor law, and the centerpiece of our policy package is a prohibition on firearm purchase or possession by people who've been convicted of any misdemeanor crime of violence. What's different here from current federal law, again, is that federal law only precludes people who commit a crime at the felony level. So if you commit a violent crime at the felony level, you can't possess a gun. But most misdemeanor crimes of violence, with the exception of domestic violence, is not a prohibitor. And so we have a definition here. A misdemeanor crime of violence is any misdemeanor conviction involving the use, attempted use, or threatened use of physical force against the person or property of another, or that by its nature involves substantial risk that physical force against the person may be used. Crimes of violence constituting a misdemeanor may include, but are not limited to, assault, battery, stalking, or an attempt or conspiracy to commit any of those offenses. In order to be effective, these violent misdemeanor laws must include actual acts of threatened violence, not just acts of violence, acts that involve a substantial risk of the use of violence, including the use of physical force, attempts to commit violence, even if unsuccessful, plans to commit violence, acts that are part of the commission of another crime that may be nonviolent, but which involve a substantial risk that violence may be used in the course of committing that crime, acts that result in a protective order, and stalking, cyber stalking, and electronic social media threats of violence. Okay, so the second policy is we need an efficient and minimally intrusive way to assess if someone meets that threshold. So what is the most efficient and most effective way to determine if someone has committed a misdemeanor crime of violence? And the answer is pretty simple. A state and local background check, not a federal NICS check, but a state and local background check. And so how do you implement that? There's a very solid body of research, again, that supports this idea that state and local background checks are the most effective way to screen for violent misdemeanors. Well, there's really two ways to do this. One is to do it the way we currently do with universal background checks. But there are 6 major problems with point of purchase background checks. First, there's inconvenience and inefficiency. A gun owner may need to go through a new background check every single time they buy a gun. Well, they do. They need to go through a background check every single time they go to buy a gun. So they may go buy a gun one day. If they decide to buy a gun the next day, they have to go through another background check, even though the previous day the dealer saw them and they were perfectly fine. There's a risk of felony for lending a gun to a family member. This is of great concern to many gun owners. This was very commonly expressed to us, that family members are concerned that they can't sell or even lend a gun to a family member under some states' laws unless the person undergoes a background check. And in many situations, that's impractical. It may mean going to a federally licensed dealer. If they're in a rural area, they have to drive 3 or 4 hours to get to a dealer. You're not going to do that just so you can go hunting with your brother. It doesn't. It's a major imposition. There's the third problem is the extreme inconvenience of private sales. Some states have universal background checks that require every sale to go through a federally licensed dealer. Again, in a rural area, it might be 3 or 4 hours away. The fourth major concern, and this was very common among gun owners, was the potential of creating a gun registry. So 3 states, as of 2020, had an actual gun registry as part of their law, but an additional 6 states had registries because of the point of purchase sales records and the way that they were being kept. So essentially, they didn't have a formal registry, but essentially they did have a registry. That is a major concern of gun owners. Fifth is simply the ineffectiveness, the incompleteness of the NICS database. It's especially limited with respect to misdemeanor violations, such as domestic violence crimes. And 6, there's evidence that they don't work. In studies that have looked at at point of purchase background checks, research has shown that they're just not effective unless they're coupled with a state permit system. So the way that we decided to get around this and to institute the checks to see if someone has a violent misdemeanor is through a state permit system. And the advantage of this permit system is that, on the one hand, it strengthens the effectiveness of laws to keep guns out of the hands of people at the highest risk for violence. So this is clearly a win for public safety compared to point of purchase checks. And for gun owners, it actually eliminates the interference with the right of gun owners to obtain guns that are associated with our current point of purchase background check system and our registries and our extensive records that are kept every time a gun is purchased, including the serial number and the model. And the ATF can go through these records anytime they want, unannounced. This is a big interference. And so a state permit system can actually do both of these. We talked about balancing the rights of gun owners and the need to protect public safety. And here we find that we believe this can be a win-win situation. It does not have to be a concession situation where gun owners have to concede something in order to have this policy to protect the public safety. So how does a state permit system address this? Well, it addressed the inconsistency and the inefficiency because you don't need a background check. Basically, if you have a permit system, you just get the permit. It would be renewed every 5 years. But during that 5 years, you don't need a background check. You just show your permit. If it's valid, you're set to go. You don't have to worry anymore about risk of felonies for lending guns to family members, because as long as a family member has a valid gun permit, you're good to go. The inconvenience of private sales, you don't have to worry about it because private sales can take place. You don't need a background check, but what you do need is a valid permit. So you wouldn't even need to have licensed dealers present at gun shows like you do now. The potential of a gun registry would be minimal, if not non-existent, because under our proposed permit system, there is no registry of the gun that you purchase, the model or the serial number. It is simply like a driver's license. It just tells you that you have the right, not that you have the right, but that you have been approved to execute your right to own a gun because you don't have a violent misdemeanor history. In fact, having a permit would not necessarily mean that you have a gun. You could have a permit, be approved to purchase guns and possess them, but not actually do that. Just like someone with a driver's license doesn't mean that they have a car. They may have a driver's license for identification, and at some point they may get a car, but they don't necessarily have a car. So it would not be a registry. It overcomes the problem of the incompleteness of the NICS database because it relies on state and local databases. And finally, while evidence suggests that point of purchase systems don't work, there's overwhelming evidence that permit systems do work significantly to reduce firearm homicide, firearm suicide, and the incidence of mass shootings. So how would this work? Just very briefly, it would be a background check. Would it have to be done? You would have to have it done once every 5 years. Then no more background checks needed at point of purchase. You would just show your valid permit. Federal background checks at point of purchase would be waived. That is currently the policy of the FBI. That basically, if the state has a valid permit system in place, the form 4473 has a checkbox, and the dealer just checks that box and says the background check is exempt because this person has a valid permit. As far as borrowing and selling to friends or family members, there wouldn't need to be a background check as long as they have a valid permit. And that can easily be checked through a privacy protected database that would be accessible. You can purchase guns from private sellers without having to go through a dealer, again, as long as you have a valid permit. The system would be shall issue. There would be no more may issue, no need for a may issue system, because the permit means you have no history of a violent misdemeanor. There would be no registry. And finally, it would open the door to concealed carry and just carry reciprocity. Because as long as the state has this permit system in place, other states can recognize those permits knowing that the person has been checked to see if they have committed a violent misdemeanor. Okay. So this is basically the way it would work. Just a couple other points about it. Obtaining a state permit would involve simply the state and local background checks to rule out a history of violent misdemeanor crimes. It would not involve interviews. It would not involve references. It would not involve having to prove a reason for owning a gun. A lot of the things that New York recently put in place, which is more like applying to college than applying for a gun, would not be in place. There would be two types of permits, a general and concealed carry. You could apply for both in the same application. They'd be available at low cost, and they would be renewed every 5 years. As I said, there would be a mechanism to prevent someone who already has a gun, they have a permit, but they later meet the threshold by committing, say, a violent misdemeanor. They would lose their permit, essentially. The permit would be revoked. Okay, I'm going to skip that because I have a feeling somebody's going to ask me that question, and I want to make sure there's time for questions. So the third policy are red flag laws. This is pretty straightforward, but what I want to just go through is the provisions, the specific provisions that would be included in this policy. So there would be a timely due process hearing at which the subject of the proposed order could appear and present evidence. There would be a fine for anyone who vindictively makes a false accusation against a gun owner for the purpose of trying to harm them. There would be a process for expeditious return of firearms to a person once they're no longer under the protection order. There would be a process for gun owners to file appeals if they believe that the expeditious return was being violated. There would be a free government-funded consultation and examination by a mental health professional with an offer of referral for help should they be found to be in need of a mental health treatment, a training procedure for law enforcement officers who may be involved in confiscating guns from subjects who may be at risk of harm because of mental health issues. And then there would be a procedure to ensure that newly issued extreme risk protection orders are reported in a timely manner to the state database, and that there would be prompt removal from the state permit database when the order expires. To close, these are our estimates for the effect of this package. If this package were implemented, we believe it could have a 28% reduction in homicide rates and a 4% reduction in overall suicide rates, which is a huge effect, according to the research. Okay, so at this point, just one last point, sorry. We talked a little earlier about the role of the state versus the federal government. All of these policies would be adopted at the state level. However, there are a couple of things that the federal government could do. First, they could enact the violent misdemeanor law, which would close the federal loophole, and it would encourage states to follow suit. They could make sure to provide NICS exemptions for point of purchase background checks for states that have these permit laws. And then they could provide financial incentives to encourage states to enact permit laws and red flag laws. And that money could be used to pay for the mental health exams and reduce the cost of permits. So that is the platform. And I think I'm going to, sorry. The last thing is what we excluded from the platform. And we specifically excluded assault weapon bans, mainly because there's no real conceptual basis for these policies. They're based on cosmetic features of the gun that don't directly affect the lethality. And there's also a lack of empirical research showing that they have any effect. There's also strong opposition by gun owners. And this is not consistent with the identified common ground. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. And let's see, I'm just going to go right from the top and I'll go in order. And I'll try to get to as many as I can. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Question, are gun owners really a monolithic group or are they subdivided among clear subgroups? Well, clearly they are not a monolithic group. They are clearly divided among subgroups. We did research in which we actually segmented gun owners into groups. We used a latent class analysis, which is a fancy statistical procedure, but we actually grouped gun owners into 3 or 4 different classes that differed in different ways. So there's no question that they're not a monolithic entity. There are clear subgroups, but with that said, our research does show that the overwhelming majority of gun owners do support these policies across all of these different segments, or most of these different segments. Can you elaborate further on the process required to obtain a permit? How long would it take? And what information is reviewed besides local and state databases for misdemeanor or felony history? Well, the idea of this would be to try to make it a very quick process. 48 to 72 hours would be the goal. The only thing that would really be checked would be the state and local databases checking for criminal history. That would be the emphasis. Because of federal law, you would also have to check for a drug history and involuntary mental, commitment. But those are not really the hallmarks of the major aspects of what would happen in the permit process. This is really about making sure that people do not have violent misdemeanors on their record. Third question, since the excuse by the NRA and Second Amendment enthusiasts for not supporting universal background checks is always to warn of a slippery slope, have you or can you do research that proves that slippery slope arguments are bogus? All I can do is try to convince people through the fact that we are, look, we are in this platform, we are renouncing assault weapons bans. I think that's a pretty good indication that we don't have something else up our sleeve. This is not a trick. We're not trying to get these 3 policies in so that we can then, say, oh, well, by the way, what we really want is an assault weapons ban. There needs to be a certain level of trust, and that needs to be earned. And so, my hope is that I've earned that trust through the care with which we've tried to look at the concern of gun owners. Hopefully that's clear. But if not, it's something, we need to earn. Fourth, how will Bruin decision impact gun safety legislation? Well, that's a great question. And one of the advantages of this platform is that it's perfectly suited as a post-Bruin policy. And then let me give 2 reasons for that. So the first problem with Bruin, not problem with Bruin, but the first implication of Bruin is that it gets rid of most may issue laws. Not completely, but it gets rid of the part of the laws where people need to show a purpose, a valid purpose for owning a gun. Well, in reality, what we found in our research is that the only real reason why we need may issue laws, the only reason why may issue laws are effective is because states don't have laws that prevent violent criminals, misdemeanor criminals, from possessing guns. In other words, if your criteria that you list for possessing a gun are comprehensive, then you don't need a may issue law. You don't need to give police discretion, right? The whole point of a may issue law is that it gives police discretion. Why is that discretion needed? The only reason the discretion is needed is because they're not allowed to deny permits to people who they know have a violent history if it doesn't come out at the felony level. So they may know, the local sheriff may know that this person has a history of violent crime, but it's not a felony. And since that's not a prohibitor in state law, they can use their discretion to say, you know what, I know this person, they have a record, they're not getting a gun. Well, you don't need that under our platform, because under our platform, any violent misdemeanor is disqualifying. So once they do the check and determine that you don't have a violent misdemeanor, it's a comprehensive check. And then there's no more discretion needed. You've done all the checks that you need to do. So it essentially allows us to even though Bruin knocks down these may issue laws, it essentially makes up for that because you no longer need the may issue law. The second reason why I think this set of policies is particularly appropriate given Bruin is that all of these are policies that are going to survive post-Bruin. It's very clear that permit requirements are acceptable. In fact, Bruin states clearly and definitively that it is constitutional. It does not violate the Second Amendment to require permits. I mean, they specifically state that in the decision. So we know that the permit requirements are going to hold up. We know the violent misdemeanor requirements are going to hold up. And I don't anticipate any major challenge to the red flag law since we're dealing with people who are at high risk of violence. And there is a history in the United States going way back of taking guns away from people who have high risk for violence, especially if they're Black. But that history is well established. So I don't see any, I think this set of policies is an appropriate one because it's not going to be overturned by Bruin. Okay, next question. When you did your work on reducing tobacco death, did you include the views and opinions of smokers in crafting your policy solutions? That is a terrific question. And so the answer is yes. In fact, the idea for trying to approach the problem in this way, for me, came from my experience in tobacco control. Because what happened with tobacco control is it started as a fight between smokers and non-smokers. It really did. And the game didn't change until smokers and non-smokers got together, started talking, found common ground, and then it really became a battle of the public versus the tobacco industry. And that's when we basically were able to take on the industry and win. And so I think the same thing is true here with gun violence prevention. I think it's only by bringing gun owners and non-gun owners together and uniting as a public that is supporting these laws that we're really going to see a lot of action take place. The next question is, how many states have permit laws, and what can we do to help enable permit laws at the state and local level, particularly in red states? So right now, there are approximately 12 states that have comprehensive state permit laws. There are an additional 6, I believe, that have permit laws for handguns only, not for long guns. What can we do to enable these laws? I mean, I think the whole point of this platform is to basically say to policymakers, hey, look, here is a policy package that was designed specifically with the input of gun owners to try to find ways, easy ways, simple ways to reduce gun violence by a large amount without interfering with gun rights. And in fact, by making it easier in many ways for gun owners to obtain guns. There are a lot of wins here, a lot of potential wins here for gun owners. I think that's going to make the major difference, because when you go to your state legislature and, as a gun violence prevention organization, say, hey, we want you to do this for public health, that's one thing. In a red state, maybe that's not going to go over that well. But if you go to them and you say, hey, we're a coalition of gun owners and non-gun owners, and we want you to look carefully at this package because it protects public health, evidence-based, but at the same time, look at all these things that it can do for gun owners. I think it's going to have a very different impact. And this is all consistent with what we heard from the congressional panel today. We heard consistently from Congressman Walsh, Congressman Moulton, that, we need to go in as a unified coalition of the public, not just gun owners and non-gun owners, even having gun owners leading the charge. And we need to also emphasize that these are policies that are designed to meet this delicate balance of being effective in reducing firearm homicide, but at the same time, not interfering or interfering minimally with the ability to access guns, and providing what I think are unprecedented protections that have never been really thought about for gun owners, especially this idea of the repeated paperwork that forms gun registries that essentially, has the model and serial number of every gun that every gun owner owns. Okay.
Dr. Siegel, we have time for one more question. There are several more questions, and we can try to, if people are interested in having Dr. Siegel answer some of these questions via email, they can feel free to reach out to us and we'll do the best we can to answer any additional questions. But one final question is, how would requiring gun owner purchase of firearm liability insurance fit into this policy package and analysis?
So that is not part of the package. I mean, I think that that's a separate issue, and I think that there are certainly some benefits of doing that. But I think I guess I would say that that's not. It's just beyond the scope of our package here. It's really because it's getting away from the focus on kind of keeping guns away from people who shouldn't have them because they're at high risk. So, I would basically just kind of defer on that one.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Siegel. As you know, we really appreciate all of your work and your team's work and your insight and collaboration on this. It's been a long process, and while not everybody will agree with everything here, we've really tried to, and you've really tried, and your team has really tried to hear the perspective of gun owners and non-gun owners, and to really, as some of the panelists alluded to earlier today, take into account the expertise gun owners have in certain areas that often is not reflected in policy and legislation. So we really appreciate it, and look forward to kind of continuing to collaborate with you on these things. And as I said, I know we will try to follow up with folks who have additional questions and create opportunities to hear more about Dr. Siegel's research. Just as just in closing out the conference this afternoon, I did want to briefly share the 97% roadmap that does come directly from Dr. Siegel's research. As Dr. Siegel talked about, we chose to focus on just a limited set of policies that were deemed to be the most effective at reducing gun deaths, and also that would be supported by gun owners and non-gun owners alike. And as Dr. Siegel just stated in his presentation, this package of policies has the demonstrated potential to reduce gun-related homicides by 28% and gun-related suicides by more than 6%, according to the research that Dr. Siegel and his team conducted. What's really important, and as we review this quickly, is that this is a package of policies. They are reinforcing with one another, and so to kind of have the effect that Dr. Siegel talked about, they need to work together. So the first point, and I think this is one that is not talked a lot about in the press and media, probably because most people didn't realize that it was this way, which is, as Dr. Siegel said, to make sure that violent criminals can't access guns by closing the loophole, which allows people who are convicted of violent misdemeanors to purchase guns in most states. And, for example, just this week with the UVA tragedy, while we obviously don't know a ton of details, it does appear clear that the gunman had a violent misdemeanor charge from 2021. And so based on this policy package, this roadmap package here, that would have excluded him from purchasing a firearm. As Dr. Siegel talked about, step 2 is obviously states and local government need a mechanism to assess if someone is a violent criminal prior to purchasing a gun. And that's where the gun permit laws at the state level, in conjunction with the background checks, are so important. And again, as the research showed, while federal and universal background checks are very important, state background checks are also critical because they often have the most relevant and up-to-date information, particularly as it would relate to violent misdemeanors. And then the final point that's been discussed a great deal on the panels today, that seemed to have support from people on all sides of this issue, is obviously that ensuring that people are at high risk of committing violence in the immediate future cannot access guns via red flag laws. Dr. Siegel spoke a lot about, and we think it's really important that that there are clear due process protections for gun owners as part of red flag laws. And we believe that implementation of the laws will be more successful if those protections are actually in place and people feel that they're credible. And then from an organizational standpoint, we are going to be sharing this research and the implication over the coming weeks and months. You can go ahead and check out all of this research that Dr. Siegel spoke about. If we can move to the next slide, please. All of the research that Dr. Siegel spoke about today, as well as our platform, is available on our website at 97%.us. And if you want to learn more about any of those items or things, please feel free to reach out to us as well. In closing this afternoon, I just want to express our gratitude for all the speakers who spoke today, to Governor Cooper, Representatives Dean, Moulton, and Walsh, who obviously literally came straight from the House floor to participate, Secretary Duncan, Steph Feldman, and all of our advocates, members of the media, academics, and thought partners. As you saw, some of these conversations weren't comfortable and they weren't easy for people to participate in. But the fact that people are willing to come to the table and have those conversations is what 97% is trying to do. And so we appreciate the people who are willing to put themselves in those vulnerable positions. I want to thank our team for their tireless work in putting this together. And I want to thank all of you for attending today and for trying to keep an open mind as we navigate through these conversations. And we discuss things that we might not only agree on, but we might not even share a common set of experiences from which to view this issue. But this is part of the process, and we look forward to continuing to engage with everyone in this way going forward. Thanks again for your participation, and wishing everybody a very happy Thanksgiving.